We all know Aang is the last surviving airbender after his people got slaughtered by the Fire Nation. But was he? Is it really plausible that the Fire Nation managed to track and kill every airbender and air nomad? What if there was a survivor who managed to pass down their Air Nation heritage to a character we all know very well? Okay, so we know Ty Lee is a friend of Princess Azula who hopes to try to capture Aang throughout the show. However, when looking back at her introduction, two things become readily apparent. Can you notice them? One defining aspect of Ty Lee is that she is shown to be very agile, both in her time in the circus as an acrobatic performer, but also in her fighting style. Throughout Aang's battles in the show, he constantly is using his agility and flexibility to dodge and airbend at his opponents. He maneuvers around his opponents by ducking, jumping, and sidestepping to flow around his opponents and uses their own strength against them. Does this sound familiar? Similar to how Aang and by extension airbenders fight, Ty Lee uses a fighting style that takes advantage for agility, doing somersaults and dodging attacks with ease. Her evasive maneuvers pair perfectly with her chi blocking, allowing her to get close to her opponents and disable their strength. While Ty Lee's style of fighting is much more aggressive compared to Aang, they both utilize agility and speed over brute force, and Ty Lee is skilled enough to where it almost seems as though she's aided by air. So, while Ty Lee sharing a similar fighting style and agility as airbenders isn't the greatest proof of her being a descendant of the Air Nation, this next piece of evidence is much more convincing. Remember when I said her introduction made two things apparent? Look closely. Don't her eyes resemble a certain someone? Or a certain group of people? When looking at members of the Fire Nation, they all appear to have either yellow, gold, or brown eyes, but not gray eyes. When seeing the airbenders in Aang's flashback, they all appear to have the same gray eyes, indicating this is part of their ethnicity. Okay, but what does this mean? Just based on her appearance, Ty Lee appears to be at least partially air nomad, but then this brings up another question. How did her Air Nation descendant survive? The show makes it very clear that Aang is the last surviving airbender, and presumably, the last air nomad as his culture is wiped off to Earth when he wakes up. The air temples he fondly remembers were damaged and long abandoned with clear signs of the Fire Nation invading. But does this mean that every air nomad was dead? While the Fire Nation did massacre the air nomads with presumably no survivors, I find it hard to believe they were truly all killed. There were multiple air temples, so unless the Fire Nation was able to attack every temple at the same time, there may have been time to warn some air nomads about the incoming attack. Even if we assume that all the air nomads and airbenders at the main air temples were killed, would every air nomad truly have been there at the same time the Fire Nation attacked? While the live-action adaptation of Avatar attempts to answer this by having a festival conveniently with all the air nomads in one location, it still doesn't seem plausible. One of the comics directly referenced surviving air nomads by showing Fire Nation traps used to capture survivors of the genocide, making this theory even more plausible. So after the show, there were comics that went deeper into the lore of Avatar, and one of these comics was called Relics and was published in Avatar: The Lost Adventures. The comic takes place in Book 1, Water, or the first season of Avatar. The gang is somewhere in the Earth Nation colonies, where Aang finds a merchant who is selling an airbender pendant. Aang is naturally excited about this, and even more so when the merchant reveals he got the pendant recently, from another merchant who was on the highest mountain. He ends up sneaking off in the middle of the night to find the man who sold the air pendant. When he finds a stupa with airbending markings, he naturally assumes there must be airbenders. As Aang continues exploring the mountain, he finds a man-made cave that has airbending artifacts, and it seems like he's finally found another air nomad. Sadly, this was all a setup by Admiral Zhao, and there were Fire Nation soldiers waiting for him. Admiral Zhao then gloats as he explains how these artifacts were used by Fire Lord Sozin to lure the remaining airbenders who escaped the initial attack. So does this mean that only a few air nomads weren't at the temples or escaped? I find this very hard to believe. Air nomads are by definition nomads, meaning they were wanderers who were likely spread out around the world beyond the air temples. Some may have also chosen to live in another nation during the attack. While the Fire Nation did continue to track down air nomads attempting to find the Avatar, it would have been extremely difficult to track them all, especially if the air nomads were hiding in other nations that they couldn't just check. I started asking myself, wouldn't it have been near impossible for surviving air nomads to disguise themselves, due to their distinctive Air Nation tattoos? And yes, this would have made it very difficult for most airbenders to disguise themselves. But this wouldn't apply to airbenders who hadn't received their tattoos yet. Remember, airbenders aren't simply given their tattoos freely. Like any other airbender, Aang had to earn his tattoos by becoming skilled enough in airbending to be considered an airbending master. This also doesn't apply to regular air nomads who couldn't airbend and didn't have tattoos. With this in mind, it's entirely plausible that there could be air nomads in other nations as long as they didn't airbend or give away their identity. After all, Hama was able to secretly live in the Fire Nation by blending in and not waterbending where people could see her. So surviving air nomads likely abandoned their culture in order to hide from the Fire Nation. When Haru's Earth Kingdom village was occupied by the Fire Nation, the people there were extremely cautious in avoiding any part of Earth Kingdom culture and couldn't even earthbend. So while there are likely no surviving airbenders, at least none with tattoos, there could have been surviving air nomads who integrated themselves into other nations and left descendants. But how does this all tie in with Ty Lee? After all, she grew up in the Fire Nation. Going back to Fire Lord Sozin, what if I told you he actually had a sister, who became an air nomad? As Fire Lord Sozin and his sister grew up, they were exposed to air nomad teachings and philosophy. Remember, this was before the Fire Nation became obsessed with spreading only their ideology around the world. At the time, they were receptive to other cultures and philosophies around the world from groups like the Air Nomads. There were even education centers built dedicated to learning Air Nomad teachings. This implies that the Fire Nation and Air Nomads were closely connected with each other at one point and could have married each other. After all, Fire Lord Sozin's sister herself married an Air Nomad. Something else that is interesting is that Fire Lord Sozin's sister learned chi blocking in order to defend herself as she couldn't firebend. The exact same technique we see Ty Lee using throughout the show. With all this in mind, it's not too far-fetched to assume one of Ty Lee's ancestors was an air nomad or airbender. So then, why couldn't Ty Lee, or by extension her family, airbend if they had an airbender or air nomad as their ancestor? There's two possible reasons for this. Ty Lee's ancestor could have been an air nomad who couldn't airbend. This would imply that airbending couldn't be genetically passed down from her ancestor. This is plausible if bending had a genetic and spiritual component. After all, Ty Lee is in touch with her spiritual side as she's always reading people's moods through their aura. The other possibility is that Ty Lee's ancestor was an airbender and Ty Lee simply wasn't lucky enough to be gifted with airbending. Just because there is an ancestor or parent who could bend, it doesn't automatically mean that children will also be able to. If we think of bending as a genetic trait, if one parent carries it while the other parent doesn't, the child has a chance of inheriting and not inheriting the trait. This is why Katara was able to waterbend and Sokka wasn't able to despite them having the same parents. This same scenario could have easily happened in Ty Lee's family with none of them having received this airbending gene. After all, Ty Lee's airbending ancestor would have died at least 100 years ago. Now sadly, we'll likely never know for sure whether there were any air nomad survivors from the genocide, or even if there were any air nomads when Aang woke up from his 100-year slumber. Even as evidence indicates for there being survivors who passed on descendants, these air nomads were forced into hiding into the other nations where they couldn't risk practicing their culture at the risk of being exposed. Their descendants likely didn't pick up on air nomad culture and traditions and instead likely assimilated the culture from the nation they grew up in, such as Ty Lee living in the Fire Nation. So even with Ty Lee's Air Nation heritage, she never got to experience any of it, and thus wasn't able to share or appreciate its culture with Aang, leaving him as the true last surviving member of the Air Nation who held its values.